Welcome to Lesson 2 from our survey of Genesis. This is part 2 of the lesson that I started in the last session. And if you didn't have a chance to look at that, I would encourage you to do so. This lesson definitely builds on that lesson. In that lesson, we talked about some of the divisions that we have around this account and how that affects our worldview and how our worldview is affected by the reading of Genesis. And it's important as we go into this lesson to acknowledge, for me anyway, that my perspective is a Christian worldview and that we're looking at a historical account of the beginning of creation, the beginning of our solar system, this planet, and most especially the creation of God's special human beings on this earth. And chapter 2 is a deep dive into that creation and gives us more detail about what happened on day 6 than is included in the first chapter. So it's a encouraging and interesting study. And as I indicated last week, while we are going to look at these scriptures, I'm not going to read all of them for you. You're probably pretty familiar with the story, at least from Bible class or having heard it before. But we really want to focus on how does this lesson instruct us? Not just inform us, but how does it instruct us? And what lessons do we pull from it for our human experience? Because I believe this account is not only here for historical purposes, but really more to teach us. Teach us about our nature, teach us about how we interact with one another, teach us about God's intention for our relationships and our relationship with Him and where we stand right now in our relationships with one another and with God. So this is a transition of focus. And this intro that you see here in chapter 2 talks about generations. And this is going to be a theme that's repeated 11 times in Genesis. So this is the first of 11 different instances where Moses is going to talk about these are generations. And it tells us one of the primary purposes of this part of Genesis, really the rest of the book, and especially this section, is to introduce this idea that we live within a continuum of generations and that there are people who went before us, and here's an account of their actions and what happened and how they lived. Once again, not only to instruct and inform us, but to sort of tie us into our past, right? And what we share with that past. This word for generations, the Greek word is Genesis, which we often think of as really meaning beginning, but the Hebrew word is toledot, or generations. So really from one perspective, the English title of this book could be Generations. And it really does speak primarily to the generations that begin with the creation of the first man and woman and then follow through all the way through the chosen people entering into Egypt at the end of the book. This is also, in this particular passage, the first time that God's proper name is going to be used. So the second chapter of Genesis, you see Lord God. And when you see this, particularly in your English translations where Lord is capitalized fully, what you're really seeing is God's proper name, Yahweh Theos, Yahweh Theos. So Lord God. And what the Hebrew writers would do in this situation is substitute the Hebrew word Adonai, the Greek word Kyrios, which is Lord, for God's proper name, out of respect for His proper name. And in some cases, they would just include the consonants of God's proper name and not the vowels, once again, out of respect. I think that God would be okay with us using His proper name, but we are obviously going to, as we have the scriptures on the screen, go with the English translation, in this case the ESV, and how they represent this. Most importantly, this passage establishes the start of the framework here within creation. In other words, this says these are the generations of the heavens and earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and heavens. In other words, what's about to follow is nestled within that framework of creation that we talked about in the last lesson. It's obviously not talking about the exact day that God made earth and heavens, which was that beginning point that we talked about, nor is it talking about day 1 or day 2, when the solar system was created and when continents and oceans were separated. We know that the Lord God started making the generations of humans on day 6. And so I mentioned in the last lesson that this Hebrew word for day is a really flexible word, kind of like the Hebrew word for made. And in this case, it really seems to be communicating in the day, like back in the day, right? Or in the days of creation is when this creation of the first man and woman happened, right? So what we're actually doing is we're stepping back into the 6th day to get more detail. And our starting point should be that passage that we looked at last week in Genesis chapter 1 that talks about that 6th day. And it should remind us of that special nature that we talked about in the last lesson, where we're both formed and created, that we were formed and made from the elements that are present, in other words, from the dust of the earth, but we also are created with a unique nature. We're created in His image and after His likeness. It's also important to remember one of the points that we made from last lesson, that God is fellowship, right? Inherently, our triune God is fellowship. And His nature of fellowship is also reflected in our nature, both in the fellowship that we're to have with our Creator, with God, but also to an extent the fellowship we're supposed to have with one another, and especially the fellowship we're supposed to have between married men and women. Also, notice the repetition. Now, we didn't really touch on that in the last lesson, but you see the same description happening in repetition. So let us make man in our image after our likeness. And then he makes this point. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the earth and over the livestock, over all of the earth and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His image. So there's your first point, your setup. Man in our image, dominion over the earth, created in His image is repeated. In the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. So obviously a really, really important point about our nature in His image and in His likeness. And then He repeats the dominion point and says, I want you to multiply and fill the earth, and as part of that you're going to have authority over the planet. And I've given you plants to eat, and you will have them for food, and also the animals that I put on earth I've provided for as well. So apparently, according to this passage, humans and animals were vegetarians to start with. And you can go to Genesis chapter 9 to see where God changed the diet for humans at least. And we don't really know about animals and whether they were vegetarians all the way up until after the flood or not. But nevertheless, the main point is God had provided a planet that would support the life that He created and is nurturing and taking care of that planet. In this chapter 1 account of the creation of humans, we see a royal view of creation, right? A view of man created in God's image and having rule or authority in this creation that God made, right? When we step into chapter 2, we're going to see more of a priestly telling of that creation, in that it's talking about not just authority, but service. And what were the expectations for these human beings with regard to providing service, both to God and to this creation. So we'll step into the rest of chapter 2, and it sets the scene or the timing for God's creation of man on that 6th day. And it indicates that this is before there was any kind of agriculture. It was before there was any dedicated irrigation. There were rivers, as we're going to find out, and there was vegetation, but the bushes and plants of the field, cultivated type agriculture, didn't exist. And the reason it didn't exist is because man hadn't been created with the purpose to do that kind of work. So there's no cultivated land yet, right? And then the nature of how vegetation is nourished is different in that there's this mist that comes up and makes sure that the vegetation has water. But to really have crops, you're going to have a different kind of approach. It's going to require irrigation and intentionality about how those crops are planted. So we get this view that the world is an untamed place, right? Lots of vegetation, mist, not a lot of structure. And so when God goes to create humans, he's going to create some structure very intentionally. He's going to plant a special garden, right? And he's going to create man and give us a little bit more details. And it says, Yahweh formed the man of dust from the ground, from the elements that are already there, which fits with our understanding of our bodies, and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature. There's been some discussion of what the nature of this breathing into the nostrils, the essence of life, or the breath of life, and whether that hints to the special nature, whether that indicates the deposit of a soul. I'll let you kind of think about that and the implications of it. But it does hint to a very personal creation, right? That there isn't just a reaching out of a finger and a spark. There's an intimate creation where God is going to breathe life into this special human being that he's creating, the first man. It also points to a physical place for this structured garden that God creates. And I put the little wrapped around the axle symbol down there because, frankly, a lot of people can get really kind of wrapped around the axle about where was Eden and what was Eden like, and maybe even wanting to make a pilgrimage to where it might have been. And so it can be a real distraction. If you actually do want to think of where Eden could have been physically, there's some hints in the narrative. It talks about 4 different rivers, 2 of which are rivers that we can go visit today if we want to, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And it talks about these rivers coming out of a single river. And so if you're looking for a place where the Tigris and the Euphrates converge, there are 2 locations in the Middle East, in the current area of Iraq today. The lower part, where the Tigris and the Euphrates join before they go into the Persian Gulf, or the upper part where the source of those 2 rivers are, up by Mount Ararat. So that could establish a reference point if it's important to you to sort of triangulate on like where this might be. One of the reasons I think it's important to think about this as a physical location is because some people have spiritualized the idea of Eden and thought of this as man and woman and life being in a spiritual existence, and that when man leaves Eden, he's leaving a spiritual existence for a physical existence. And I think the way the story is told, it points to a physical existence, right? There's a physical garden that God created for man to exist in, for him to create this experiment that is going to happen with mankind. And I don't think anything really points to a spiritualized place. I also think that trying to pinpoint the actual location of Eden involves a lot of assumptions about geography. Our view of geography today versus what it might have been then, and especially thinking about what would this have looked like after the flood. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot to be gained from talking a lot about the location, but here's a map for you if you want to think about that. More importantly, there's an experiment that is going to begin in chapter 2, and it's going to conclude in chapter 3. And I use that word experiment on purpose. It's not an experiment for God's needs. He's not setting up an experiment that says, here's the conditions, and here's a variable, and I'm going to observe what happens as if I need to know what's going to happen, because God knows exactly what's going to happen. This experiment that God is setting up is for our benefit, right? This is an experiment that we're intended to observe and learn from. This experiment we desperately need to center ourselves and our identity as humans. There's something here for us to learn. And it's not just about history. It's about our nature and where we stand with God today. So like all experiments, you start with a controlled environment and you try to limit your variables. And the garden is a controlled environment. God created it specifically to nurture the humans that he was going to create there. It talks about 3 types of trees. There's the just general trees that are good to eat and are there for nourishment. There's a tree of life that's not mentioned in this passage, but is mentioned in others. And there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. No variable yet. man is within the experiment and has free will, but has limited experience and knowledge, and all of his experience and knowledge comes directly from God. So man's experience of the world, his knowledge of the world, is going to be imparted directly from God, and his experience within the garden, this controlled environment. So to run an experiment, all you need to do is introduce a variable. Before we get to the variable, we have to stay inside this sixth day and learn more about God's intention for creating man and woman, and about authority and dominion and relationship. And so we'll step through that account. Before God closes out the sixth day and says it's a very good place to be, right? Goes from this is good to very good at the end of day 6 in chapter 1. Something needs to happen. It's not very good yet because man is alone in this creation and in this garden. And so one of the questions we ask, I said last week, we have this sort of infinite source of why questions. And the question is, why would God make human beings in a two-step process when it seems like all of the other animals were created with gender from the start? And why is there this curious parade of animals before the man? What's the purpose that God would have in having all the animals parade in front of the man in order that he would give them names? So the first purpose is that man could begin to exercise authority over creation, because naming something implies authority, especially in a Hebrew context. So as these animals walked by and man says cat, dog, horse, elephant, and of course these are English words, but it does kind of follow to me that if you give the man the responsibility for naming the animals, you're probably going to have a lot of single syllable words for animals. But regardless of what the actual Hebrew names were, or first language names were for the animals, God is giving this created man the opportunity to begin to exercise authority and dominion, which is what he intended when he created man in the first place. So that's the first thing. The other important thing about this is that God is delegating to man this responsibility, which is an important statement to the cultures around Moses when this sermon is going to be preached, right? That man is not below nature, but is actually above nature and is intended to have dominion. And so when man steps below nature and subjugates himself to natural forces or worship of nature, that's counter to God's intention for humans. And that's a lesson for us today as well, right? That we have a stewardship responsibility to take care of this creation that we've inherited and to have appropriate dominion over it in a way that nurtures it and preserves it. And that's a responsibility that we have been given, and it's a responsibility every generation needs to take seriously. Second, and I think most importantly, the purpose of the parade of animals is to point to the necessity of completing the creation of man within this sixth day. This is actually the first time that we'll see the use of the word Adam or Adam for the man's proper name. So it's not just the man. Man has a proper name, Adam, which actually means man or mankind. So this is the first of mankind. And for creation to be very good, one last creative act needs to happen on God's part, which is the creation of women. Sometimes, as is often the case even today, men just need an object lesson. We just need to see a parade of things that over and over speak truth to us, and we finally come to realize that there's a lesson here for us. And so as Adam's watching these animals go by two, he certainly starts to notice that there's something different about his existence than that of all of the other created animals, which that they are created with gender, and that they have a relationship where they're reliant on one another instinctually, and that they're multiplying, right? That they were created to have offspring. And he's looking around and doesn't see any opportunity for him to have that kind of relationship. There's no animal that's coming across that in any way is fit for that kind of relationship. Certainly not a complementary relationship. So it probably dawned on him, something's really missing, right? And so from that knowledge and from that realization, then God is going to meet a need that Adam realizes that he has. He's going to do that by forming female in a slightly different way than he formed male. And that's also an object lesson for us, that while female body is created in the same way of using the elements that are around, God decides to start with man and create woman from man. And there's, as I said, an object lesson for us. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But with that creation, the 6 days complete, and we move to the very good status, as God pronounced it in chapter 1, verse 31. The details that we find in the next chapter, chapter 3, imply that God has a very tangible and personal relationship with both the man and the woman. It talks about him walking with them in the cool of the day. They are in this state of bliss where they're enjoying the seventh-day Sabbath rest along with God, that they are resting with him in the comfort of this creation. And they're also working alongside God, working to cultivate the garden, to take care of it, to nurture it, while God works to nurture the two of them. And so what bliss must have been flowing within that garden, within that Sabbath rest. If only that Sabbath rest would have continued like that for us today, what a different existence that we would have. We don't have any idea how long the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, stayed in this relationship in the garden with God. No indication at all. No indication of whether chapter 3 just happens immediately or after an extended period of time. So you can ponder that if you want. We also don't have any idea what's happening outside the garden. So we don't know what's happening in the world at large. We only know about this very special place where God's going to conduct this experiment. We do know that when Adam and Eve exit the garden, it's into a very different reality and much more difficult than the reality that they have in the garden. So we know the garden is a special place. This last bit here, this last verse, 24-25, is a very special declaration by God of the purpose of creating men and women and creating marriage. And this is a statement by Yahweh that Jesus is going to reach back to as an anchor point, as a foundation, when challenged with the meaning of marriage. And he says, look, it goes all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the creation of the first man and woman. What is the purpose of marriage? It's to create a very special relationship, this one flesh relationship that the passage refers to, which in some respects is a reflection of the kind of fellowship that exists within our triune God. It's a reflection only, but it helps us to have at least a glimpse into what it's like to be in a special, complementary, synergistic relationship. And that's what was intended at the start. Well, we may call it the marriage prime directive. What's our prime directive for those of us that are married, recognizing the role of men and women? It was an ideal and complementary relationship that God intended, but it's not gone according to plan. And we're going to see why as the experiment concludes in chapter 3. As we step into chapter 3, we might start by asking that question, why? Why the experiment? We know that God doesn't need an experiment for his purposes. He didn't need to observe the outcome of the way he set the experiment up. He knew exactly what the outcome would be. So he's not the observer, we are the observer of the experiment. But it's important to look at how God set this experiment up and recognize that he set it up to be very binary, right? Eat the fruit of one tree or don't eat the fruit of that one tree, right? One rule, one option, and it's very binary. And I think part of the reason for that, simplicity of the experiment, is so that we can't even consider blaming God for the outcome, for making it too complicated or something that's impossible for a human to achieve. He set it up so it's very possible that they would make the right choice consistently to simply not eat the fruit of the one tree. The thing that's been missing up to this point is the variable, and the variable is temptation. Or more specifically in this case, the source of all temptation. It's also intended, I think, to parallel our own experience. Our experience of temptation, which is often binary. Make the right choice, make the wrong choice. And the moments that we have every day where we're presented the same opportunity as God sets up in this experiment, where we have the opportunity to make a choice, to exercise our free will. And so it ties us back to this moment, this sad chapter of human existence, when the wrong choice was made with the variable of temptation entering into the environment, right? And if you're parents of kids, you might recognize this kind of experiment in the way that you raise your children, that there are some times that we tee things up for the purpose of teaching a lesson, right? For correcting behavior, for providing discipline to set a child on the right course, and it starts really, really early. I think about a binary choice. One of our sons was a really stubborn child, and he wanted to exercise his free will at times when it was not in his best interest or in our best interest. And one of the things that he loved to do was he loved to push the buttons on the videotape machine. You know, back in the day, when we watched VHS cassettes, you would put a cassette into the machine, it would bring it in, and when you were done, you pushed a button and it popped it back out. Well, our son was fascinated by that process. He loved seeing the tape go in and he loved seeing the tape go out, and he knew which button you pushed to make the tape go out. And so we would be watching a show and he would very inconveniently go over and push the button to eject the tape, and we would say, "No, sir, that's a no-no." And he would continue to do it, and so we would sit there and he'd go to push the button and we would slap his hand, and he'd pull it back, and then he'd go to push the button again and we would slap his hand, and eventually he's like crying, knowing that he's got to push the button. So we eventually taped a thimble over the button just to make it so that he couldn't push it. But ultimately, we gave him the right to be the one who would put the tape in and push it out when he, understood the process. And so we gave him a responsibility. But it was just such an object lesson for us that sometimes we can't even, just in spite of ourselves, make the right decision, right? And we recreate that moment in time where a bad choice is made. Sometimes we just get in our own way. Often we just get in our own way. So we can connect with that original man and that woman, with their experience, which mirrors our own, that all too often we choose poorly. Some interesting observations about the account. It's another one of those opportunities where you can get wrapped around the axle. I didn't put the little icon there. But we assume now in retrospect, as we read the story and we see the rest of Revelation, that this is no simple snake that's going to interact with Eve and then Adam. That it seems like this animal is possessed by Satan based on the account and the way that God speaks to him after the temptation, and also other scripture, especially in Revelation, which refers back to the serpent of old and names him Satan. We also see an interesting way in which Satan works in the world in Job, in which Satan is very active and even interacts with God in a similar way as he's going to interact with God in this account. And so I think it's safe to assume that what you have here is not an ordinary animal, but an animal that has been used by Satan to create this temptation, this variable. And it's also interesting to think about the fact that this variable, our adversary, was in the world already. That before this moment in time, there was another choice to be made by other created beings, and they also chose poorly. and that in addition to fallen man, there exists fallen angels. They had some source of temptation, and we don't really know much about that. But we do know that our enemy, our adversary, was already here, and that's the variable in the experiment. It was for Adam and Eve, and it is for us. It's also interesting to me that both the man and the woman didn't seem surprised by a talking snake. So I don't know what it says about the nature of snakes back then, but it's interesting that the first reaction wasn't, why is the snake talking to me? But that the reaction was, I'm going to listen to this talking animal, and I'm going to entertain whatever it has to say. And so Satan, I believe, confronts these two humans with a question that seems like a partial truth, but is actually a lie. He says, did God, also within this whole passage of chapter 2 and chapter 3, every time you see God referenced, it's with his proper name, Yahweh Theos, except for right here. And the snake doesn't use his proper name. He says, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden, which of course is not what God said. God said there's only one tree that you're not supposed to eat. And so he poses a question that is actually leading Eve to a conclusion. And look at her response. The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God, even though she knows his name, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden. And then she actually adds something that God did not originally say. Neither shall you touch it, lest you die. God's instructions to Adam had nothing to do with touching, although I think that's probably wise. It might be the same kind of thing we would say to our kids, right? Which is, don't do illegal drugs. Don't even hang out with people who do illegal drugs. One thing is law, the other thing is just good advice. So it's possible that Adam, when he was talking to Eve about the instruction he received, said, you know what, we shouldn't even actually go near that tree. Well, that's sound advice, but it isn't what God said, right? And so it leads down this path to say, well, I'm going to consider things that aren't necessarily exactly what God said. And so Satan proposes to her that this tree will actually give her something that she doesn't have, that she deserves to have, which is open eyes, to be like God and to really understand the nature of good and evil. And up to this point, the notion of evil isn't even something that they've considered. They have no context for what that word even means. But Satan is saying, you're missing out on something here, and you need to grab a hold of that fruit, and you're going to be like God, and your eyes are going to be opened. And so he tempts her to take control of her destiny in this moment. He implies that God's being unfair to them by withholding something that they deserve. Her response is interesting. She sort of adds to the directive. And the main point right here in this moment is how both man and woman is going to respond to this binary choice. What was in the woman's nature that Satan appealed to in this moment? Maybe as the second creation, she had this sort of underlying desire to be the center of attention. Adam had been the center of attention, but she hadn't really been the center of attention. So maybe she was tempted by that. You know, this will put me in control and be the center of attention. Is there anything about Eve's response to temptation that should instruct us as humans or as women? And the second question is, as we read the account, why didn't Adam step forward to provide spiritual leadership at this critical point in time? That was his role. And we know he's there and seemingly listening to this whole exchange, but he was lazy and he didn't intervene. Why did the man make a conscious decision to join the woman and violate the one rule that God had given to them both? Is there anything about Adam's response that should instruct us as humans or as men? Is there anything about our experience raising our children that parallels the experience, like the story that I just told? Do we raise our children to not be spiritually lazy? Do we raise them to take responsibility for their decisions? And of course, the answer is yes, we do. Do we raise our children to not think they're the center of the universe and that they're in control of everything and that they can be their own gods? And of course, we do raise our children to think along those lines. But the bottom line is that they both made the wrong choice. And the follow-up turns into the blame game, which is Eve blames the serpent, Adam blames Eve, it's somebody else's fault, this decision isn't my fault. And how much like human nature is that? That when we offend, we often turn right to who's to blame besides me. And how interesting it is when we're offended that we do the opposite, right? We don't want to be accountable for our offenses. And when we certainly want to hold people accountable when they offend us. So offense was done, right? The one rule was broken inevitably. And so God's going to have to provide discipline and punishment. And there's a difference between those two words, right? So punishment is the necessary consequence for the choice that's made, and it's punitive by definition, right? Discipline has the intention of correction. And at least in the case of man and woman, God's going to provide discipline that also has the effect of being punishment. And then with regard to Satan, there's a foretelling of punishment. A good father disciplines his children, and a good mother disciplines her children to correct bad behavior and tendencies and to put them on the right path. And that's our experience of parenting, isn't it? So first, we're going to skip the snake for a moment and come back to the snake. But there's discipline that God provides to the woman that is intended to be a response to her temptation and her failure. The failure for the woman was to take control of the situation, make a decision for herself. That was a decision God had already made for her. And so in that moment, becoming like God in that she was trying to take control. And so her discipline is a reminder really to all of us, but especially to women, of how little control we really have. That if we think that we're at the center of the universe and we have control, we need to think about that again, because God's in control and we should be relying on Him, not our own control. And this sort of object lesson that God provides says there's a moment in time for a woman where it's very obvious how little control she has, and it's this moment of childbirth. And today, even with all of the modern medicine that we have, this is a moment where things can go wrong and often do go wrong. And one of the lessons that we're to take away from that is we are not in control. And if we think that we are, we need to think otherwise. And in addition to providing for the ongoing human race, this is also intended to be an object lesson that pain in childbirth, not only physical pain, but the anxiety that goes with that for the mom and the dad and everyone involved is something that we should meditate on and think about with regard to the control that we have over our situation. The second discipline is actually discipline for both the man and the woman, because he says the intended state of marriage that was created in the garden is not going to be our experience going forward. It's a consequence, not necessarily a discipline, but the reality is that marriage is going to look different outside the garden than it looked inside. And we have to look back to the garden for the pattern when we're trying to structure our marriages. But he says to the woman, your desire will be contrary to your husband. You're going to be in conflict. You're going to be at odds. Your desire for control is going to put you at odds. And he will rule over you. In other words, there's going to be conflict within marriage. And we're going to see that over and over again. We see it today. And that we're going to have to work really hard to achieve that complementary one flesh relationship that God intended in the garden. And we're going to struggle and we're going to fail. That is, in fact, our reality. It's not what God intended, but it is our reality. So we have to, as husbands and wives, really think about our nature and our tendencies. And we need to think about men, including myself, who sometimes have a tendency to shirk our responsibility. And God says, look, you're going to be accountable for your wives and your children. And does that resonate with us today? How do we feel about a man who shirks his responsibility? Do we respect that kind of man, or do we not respect that kind of man? And maybe women have a tendency to want to control things and become very anxious when they're not in control. And does that resonate with us today? How do we feel about a woman who's constantly agitated or anxious or confrontational about things that are outside her control? Do we respect that kind of woman? How do we feel about marriages where the husband rules over his wife and kids like a dictator rather than being a servant leader and looking after their needs, their best interest? How do we feel about marriages where the wife shows open disrespect for her husband and his spiritual responsibilities? We don't respect those kind of marriages. God gave us a blueprint for successful marriages, and it's up to us if we design our marriage according to the blueprint and at least have a taste of that garden bliss that they experienced. He then moves on specifically to the man, and he says, look, you were lazy. You didn't step up when you needed to, and you're going to have to work hard to be a provider for your family, to be responsible for your family, and work is going to push back. Work is going to be hard. Does that resonate with us today? Do we find that work in all of its different forms pushes back? Whether it's gardening and the weeds that inevitably pop up, whether it's housekeeping and the dust bunnies that continually pop up, and everything seems to be tending toward chaos, and the more we work to control it and to structure it, the more it pushes back, and that's certainly true in our professions. Anybody working in a workplace knows that the workplace pushes back. It's not just agriculture. And if you actually want to read a book specifically about how the world pushes back against work, then read Ecclesiastes, because Solomon had a lot to say about work and, frankly, the futility, ultimately, of thinking that we're in control at all. But it's our discipline to say we have to go about that work. And then back to the snake. So God has some very specific things to say, maybe to the animal as well as the spiritual being that's involved in this temptation. So it's kind of an interesting mix of treatment. Talks about that the snake is going to have a different reality as far as how it lives, that it's going to slither on its belly and eat the dust and be at the in conflict with the other animals and especially human beings. So maybe snakes had a different experience before this moment in time as animals. If so, I really feel bad for the snake that crossed paths with Satan in this process. But there's the snake's reality and then there's Satan's reality, which is the more important lesson here. There's certainly going to be conflict between humans and snakes, but I don't know that that's really especially different than humans and any other venomous or poisonous animal, or frankly just dangerous animal. We have conflict with members of the animal kingdom, including the snake, but we certainly have conflict with the serpent Satan, which I think is the bigger lesson. It also hints at that second supreme intervention that I talked about in the last lesson. That second supreme intervention, the incarnation, the sacrifice on the cross, the ascension to the throne, is necessitated by this moment of human failure. This moment of human failure on this chart that I got from my ESV study Bible starts out with creation and the fall that we just read about, and human existence living an Adam-like life, with grace coming into the picture through Abraham, leadership coming through David, but redemption coming through Christ. And ultimately, what we have to look forward to is not that physical Eden in the Middle East somewhere, as very good as that was. What we have to look forward to is a perfect and complete garden existence. And that's going to be an existence that has its own tree of life and its own river of life. So if you want to look at human experience, the bookends are Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 here, in Revelation 22 there, and what we have to look forward to is a different reality. As we wrap up the lesson, finally the woman gets her name. I don't know if this is sequential, she doesn't get her name up until this point, or if she got her name and this is the first reference to it, but nevertheless, the woman's name is Eve. And the naming of her is by Adam. And perhaps this is the first instance of the ruling over discipline, where Adam's going to exercise rule or authority by giving the woman a name. But the name that she is given hints at her purpose and the value that she has, which is that she's going to be the mother of the human race. And so it looks forward to her role and her contribution to the human race. Also, there's this really touching show of compassion that Adam and Eve's realization after they sin is that they're naked and that they're ashamed of the fact that they're naked and that they'd never experienced that before. And so God is going to fashion clothing for her and for him, right? And in order to provide them clothing, an animal has to make a sacrifice, which is going to be the first of a series of animal sacrifices that happen from this point forward. Poor animal that had to give up its life simply to provide clothing for the man and the woman. But it really points to God's compassion for these creatures who disobeyed his one rule. We're not sure about the nature of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's not in heaven in the last chapter. We don't know also the nature of the tree of life. We do know that God says the man can't live in this garden I created any longer, can't have access to the tree of life, that would give him some ability or nature that God doesn't want him to have, and so he has to be out of that garden and away from that tree. So he posts a cherubim at the entrance to make sure that man isn't going to be able to go back into that physical place. I don't know how long that existed, where there's a place and a cherubim with a flaming sword. Is it all the way to the flood, or did God take the garden down somewhere in between? Adam lived 930 years before he died. Now it's interesting that Satan said, "You won't surely die in the day that you fall to temptation," which was true technically, but death did start its process. And according to Peter, 1,000 days is a day to God, and a day is 1,000 years. So Adam actually did die within a day from that perspective, from God's perspective, if you want to look at it from that way. But the reality is that death entered our existence. Spiritual death, as well as physical death, entered into our human experience because of this horrible mistake in violation of that one rule that God set. So we live with that reality today. Here are some truths from the lesson that are takeaways. God is personal, as we saw in his creation and his creation of Adam. God is a fellowship. God has a goal in his creation that impacts us even today. God's creation is good. God created us in his image and invites us to share in his experience even today. Place is important to God. The place of Eden and what he created that to be, it's memorialized in the construction of the tabernacle with the cherubim to the east, just like they were positioned in the garden. So all kinds of things about place. And that's true today, that he invites us to places to experience him. Our place in history is important to God, that we're anchored into human existence and that we have a past that we need to learn from and we have a future that we can eagerly anticipate. God provides discipline to correct and guide, not just to punish. God provides a path of restoration through the second Adam, Jesus Christ, our Savior. And ultimately, God's going to perfect his creation in our eternal existence. And for that, we anxiously look forward. Next week, unfortunately, more talk of divisions. Divisions are going to be perpetuated within human relationships, and it's going to drive the human race almost to its demise. So read chapter 4, 5, and the first 8 verses of chapter 6 in preparation for the flood.